Going to read it. This is part 3. Last week we didn't really get through a whole lot. And that's okay, though, because I think that it's a topic that brings a lot of questions. It's a topic that we need to be able to process and think through ourselves. So Deuteronomy 6 verse 1 says the following. Now these are the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which the Lord your God commanded, to teach you that ye might do them in the land whither you go to possess it. That thou mightest fear the Lord thy God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command thee, thou and thy son, and thy son's son, all the days of thy life, and that thy days may be prolonged. By the way, just simple comment here. Notice his focus is not just on that generation. It's on multiple generations. And also, going to make this comment as well. He says your sons. Now, the reason he does that is not because he in some way is diminishing the role that a mother plays in the development of children. Unquestionably, that's not the case, okay? Read Proverbs 31 and you see the way it describes the role of a mother. There are several kings that it actually talks about their mother even more than their father, because in some cases, the mother was a godly woman, and she was very influential in her son's walk with God. And there are also times where the mother was very evil, and it makes a point of that. And the children that followed were following in that line of thinking. However, the reason he emphasizes father, son, and son is because the father is responsible for the home, not mom, dad, okay? And so if things are going wrong in the home, it really starts with dad, okay? And that's what he's emphasizing. And so we really need to make sure that in the raising of our children, we recognize, especially with our boys, in a generation in America where boys they're not growing up, they're not being responsible. We really need to emphasize to our young men, you need to step it up. You need to think like men, not like kids, okay? You need to take responsibility for what God has entrusted to you. So I'll continue. That thou mightest fear the Lord thy God and keep all his commandments and statutes, which I command thee, I read that. Verse 3, hear therefore, O Israel, and observe to do it, that it may be well with thee, that ye may increase mightily, as the Lord God of thy fathers hath promised thee in the land that floweth with milk and honey. Hear, Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love. Pause for a moment. He starts with the heart, okay? Obedience is something that flows out of a healthy heart. So he's not just saying, I want you to keep a bunch of rules because I want to have the facade of obedience. He says, you need to love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. That's where it starts. Obedience is something that flows out of a love for God. So if I love God, I obey him, okay? If I'm obeying him, at least what people see, it doesn't mean I love him. And there will be a point where basically a person will become a total hypocrite, and eventually that will come to the forefront. So he's emphasizing the heart here. Very important. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. And it's not just, part of your heart. All of our being needs to be given to God. These words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, shalt talk of them when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, when thou risest up, and shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and shall be as a frontlet between thine eyes. And I think the reason he mentions the eyes and the hands is not because he wants them to just have this little tradition where they put something on their hands. It's to say, your behavior needs to be guided by the instruction that I've given. So that has been our starting point for this discussion on worship. And we talked about the importance of worship. We talked about Colossians 1. We talked about Revelation 4 and Romans 11. We emphasized the fact that the first sin in Genesis 3 was really about Eve desiring to be in the position of God. And when we talk about Romans 1, and we've hit this passage many, many times, what we're looking at is a passage where that downward spiral of behavior began with not being thankful to God, okay? In other words, an entitlement of an attitude towards God is what leads to all this sinful behavior. And I mean, it's really honest. It's very true that when you look at sinful behavior, and you could take all kinds of different kinds of sinful behavior, they really come down to, I believe that I deserve something that I don't. And when I believe I deserve something that I don't, and I'm going to go ahead and act on it, then I'm really having a problem with God first, okay? I have a problem with him more than I have a problem with anything else in the world, because he is the one who gives, and he is the one who withholds, and he is the one who commands and says yes and says no. And so very, very important that we remember that. Okay, then we're getting into this issue of worship and understanding what it is. We talked about the fact that it begins with the mind, and so we shouldn't say, boy, that was a wonderful worship service. And then they say, what'd you learn about God? And they say, I don't know, I didn't learn anything about God. No, then you didn't worship him, okay? That feeling needs to be accompanied with facts, truths about him. And really, the emotions are the caboose. The emotions are to be led by sound thinking. And I would say that a proper exposition of truth and a heart that is ready to receive truth, it's going to end up moving the heart. It absolutely is essential. So then we talk about the heart, the affections, and then the physical response. And the physical response might be a word, it might be a song, it might be an action, but it's some form of expressing from the heart what we have learned with our heads, okay? And then we had a couple of examples. We talked about the Nehemiah 8 passage, which is my absolute favorite when it comes to this issue of preaching. And then we talked about the Colossians 3 passage. All right. So from there, we got into different categories of worship. And last week, we talked about private worship and got into a lot of discussion. I mentioned several scriptures. I won't reread them. Now I want to get into the issue of family worship. Okay? So the point that I'm going to emphasize here under family worship is something that really takes us all the way back to the commandments that we see in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Because what we clearly see in that verse, in those verses, is that it is the responsibility not of the community, but of the family to shape the hearts of those who grew up in the family. Now, am I saying that the community doesn't matter? Of course, I'm not saying that, okay? But what I am saying is that it is not the community's responsibility, duty to raise your children and to shape your children. It is your responsibility. And I think that this is something that we cannot underemphasize enough. Now, let me also add this, because I think it's important to state this. There are times that a community needs to hold a family accountable, okay? If there's something that happens in a family that is destructive, the family may need someone who has authority to actually defend members of the family. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that we do need human government, and we do need accountability in society. We do need the church. I think there's certainly a place for schools and those things like that. So I don't want you to think that when I emphasize the family, that I'm saying that those things are unnecessary. Those things are absolutely essential. God created human government, and human government is there for the protection of people in society. And so if families are functioning properly, then they're going to say, hey, I'm a healthy member of society, okay? My children are healthy members of society. And I'm okay with my kids interacting with people outside my home, and I'm okay with them getting schooled and trained and different things like that. But I feel the personal weight of the raising of my children. And so if you send your children to school, as a responsible parent, you need to know what they're being taught. You need to interact with them. And you might say, well, my kids go to a Christian school, so I don't have to worry about that. No, that's not true at all. It's not true at all. In fact, at least in the public school, you know what you're dealing with. In a Christian school, you might have a bunch of hypocrites. The kids say they're Christians, and they think and they act no different than lost people outside of that school context because they themselves are lost people. But they go to church, their parents go to church, and so we need to have conversations with our kids. You need to talk to your kids about what they learn in the Sunday school classrooms that are going on in this church, okay? Because the simple fact is we do the best we can with our teachers, make sure that we have people that are handling the Word of God well, but, quality control is something that's not perfect. And so we need to make sure, and, sometimes something is taught inaccurately, and that the person loves the Lord and they have every right intention, but they handle a text in a sloppy way, and you might want to know that when you talk to your children. So this issue of the family is critical. And so when we talk about worship in the church should start in the households of the people who are a part of the church, okay? Now, our church culture hopefully is shaping your thinking in a godly way so that when you work with your kids, you are actually handling that context responsibly. But it's important for us to recognize this is the starting point, okay? This is the family is the building block of the society, and that is absolutely, absolutely true, okay? So let me give you a couple of scriptures that I think are fascinating on this point. Genesis 18, verse 19. Listen to what the scripture says. This is God speaking about Abraham. He says, I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. It's a pretty interesting statement, isn't it? God is saying that I know that Abraham, and of course God knows everything, all right? But he is making the statement in time to indicate the fact that he knows that Abraham is the kind of man, the way he guides his household is going to be training those people who follow after him to have a certain kind of character. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about the story of Ruth. Ruth was from Moab. Does anybody know where the Moabites came from? They came from Lot. Yeah, they came from Lot. And it was a terrible, terrible, terrible story. Well, guess what? The Moabites were pagans. They were idolaters. You ever wonder why? Look where they came from, okay? Lot lived in Sodom. Sodom got in his family, unquestionably, okay? So God spares. He spares Lot. And so what happens? Well, the people that God in his grace spared are going to produce a people that were very, very evil. And so the Ammonites and the Moabites are the results of, we could say, God having showed grace to Lot, and Lot and his daughters having abused the grace that was given to them. But the point is that Abraham was the kind of man who handled his home life appropriately. And we should be shaping our children in every single area. But the most important area that we shape our children is how they think about God. How they think about God is the most important thing because it affects every aspect of their life. It affects how they do their work. It affects whether or not they're honest. It affects what kind of work they're willing to do. It affects how they're going to raise their children. It affects whether or not they're even going to choose to get married, or if they get married, if they want to have children, or how many children they want to have, and how they're going to raise those kids, how they're going to educate those kids, the kind of church they're going to find, if they're even going to find a church. All of those things are downstream of what we teach our children. Psalm 78, 2-5. He says, I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he hath done. Now, notice something. He says, I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us, and we will not hide them from their children. What it's basically saying, as fascinating as this would think, as this is it's saying, my parents taught me certain things, and I need to teach those things to my children who are their grandchildren. And so in some sense, I'm feeling this obligation. And by the way, there is a presupposition here that you grew up in a good home, okay? That the things that you were taught are the kinds of things you'd want to teach your children. So we do have to keep this in mind. Not every home is a healthy home, a godly home. And most certainly we hopefully are not passing on things that are detrimental. But the things that we learned that really have provided stability for us, we want to teach them to our children. And in many ways, some of the joys that our parents will experience when they're old are going to be a result of them having taught us well and us having passed on the truth to their generation. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. I'm not totally sure, to be really frank with you. Obviously, by the time you get into the time of Christ, first century Judaism, obviously you had schools. In fact, the way that the church is set up is kind of similar to the way that the synagogue was arranged. Okay, but what I would say is that people that were considered old and wise would have most definitely had influence on younger people. And, we have to remember that in those days, people were treated as adults once they hit puberty. Okay? Once they had the biological ability to procreate, they were treated as adults because with that biological ability came the responsibility to make sure they established homes and conducted themselves with dignity. And we got to realize these are pretty young people from our perspective. Kids in the junior high at our local schools would have been treated like adults in the time this would have been written. Yeah. They would have gone to war. These young men would have been going to war when they were teenagers, young men. So, yeah, interesting thought to think about. All right, he goes on to say this. He has established a testimony in Jacob, appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. Now, what I can say about what we're reading here in Psalm 78 is that really what the psalmist is talking about is the history of the people needs to be taught to the generation. And the history of the people is being taught in the context of being God's people. And this is God's law. So we have to recognize that their history, was from a perspective that was rooted entirely in God is the king of our land. And all of the blessings that we enjoy are directly from his hands and all those kinds of things. So if we were to take that concept into our contemporary context, we would say it would be learning history from a Christian perspective. Not a whitewashed perspective, but we speak honestly about what has happened, but we talk about it with a biblical worldview. Here are the consequences of these choices. This is God's intervention in history, and his providence is clearly at hand in these situations. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about, if that makes sense. But the thing that I'm trying to show you is that the family was emphasizing this. Now, someone might say, well, Joel, it's all Old Testament. Well, the Old Testament's the foundation for the New, okay? And we could put it like this. When Paul says that fathers are to not provoke their children to anger, but to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, that statement is built on the Old Testament foundation of how to raise children. Okay? So we could say if we really want to understand what it means to not provoke our children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, we got to read what the Old Testament says about raising kids, about what our duties are. Okay? So very, very important piece. Any questions there before we keep moving? All right. The next thing we have is corporate worship. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. Here's what it says. And I'm gonna make some comments about this because I do think that this passage has the potential to be misunderstood, misused. Okay? And let us consider one another to provoke to love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see the day approaching. Now, when the writer of Hebrews writes these words, he is not thinking in terms of the way we tend to think of this, okay? Now, I am a firm believer in the Lord's Day, okay? I think that Sunday should be a day dedicated to the Lord. I absolutely believe that. I also believe that the scriptures don't necessarily lay out all the details as to what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable on the Lord's Day, okay? But what I can say is this. This verse is not, okay, you missed Sunday school this week, so you just broke Hebrews 10, 24, okay? Or I didn't see you at prayer meeting on Wednesday night, and so, you violated this command, and I should give you a really hard time about it, okay? Now, I'm saying that to be honest. I am in no way trying to encourage people to not be at our services. And as we get later into this discussion, I'm going to explain to you that each time that we assemble has a different focus. And that's the way that I see it. And as I think about how I try to encourage people who are involved in our corporate worship context, I am explaining to them sometimes, or maybe I don't explain it, but I'm in my mind working from certain principles. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. But Hebrews 10 is talking about a group of people who are tempted to walk away from the church context, okay? And the reason that they're tempted to walk away from the church context is from my perspective, kind of understandable. I didn't say it was right. I said it's understandable. What I mean by that is if they were to explain to you, here's why I'm going back into Judaism and walking away from the assembly of the local church, I would go, I get your point. Doesn't make it right, but I understand that you are presenting a case for why it would be better for you to not be a part of the church context. And the ultimate reason was that they were facing intense persecution. And the focus of the persecution for these Christians was really not Rome. It was the Jewish community, okay? They were experiencing a lot of pressure from people who were family members. And they said, you've rejected our culture, you've rejected our belief system, you've rejected our religious context. And so they're feeling the pressure of family, they're feeling the pressure of work. I mean, let's be honest. A lot of times people get their jobs because of who they know. I mean, that's just the truth. All right. Not everybody gets their job that way, but having a friend who trusts you and knows your work ethic and knows what you're able to do may very well help you get the job that you have. And it was no different in those days. So a lot of people's livelihood in many ways was connected back to their culture. They're Jews, okay? But they're Christians. And so he basically says this, look, it is not acceptable for you to walk away from the church because it will be easier for you in that place. That's what he's saying. And the reason goes deeper than just, well, you need to do this out of commitment. There's a side to it where you need to understand the value of the church. Now, I also feel like I have to make this preface as well. Not every church is a healthy church. Not every church is actually going to help you grow. That's why the church you're in is it's so important that, especially as you're raising your children, in a church context that is healthy, that is vibrant, that is doing things the way that they should do it. But notice the things that he says. He says we need to consider one another. So one of the things that's nice about a church our size, maybe some people, it makes them feel uncomfortable, I don't know. The truth is, I know everybody that's here isn't. Every single Sunday, I do an attendance sheet off of my head, okay? I remember every family. I remember who's there. I do this every single Sunday. I don't do that because I'm trying to keep tabs necessarily. I do that because if I don't see somebody for a couple of weeks, it indicates, hey, something might not be right. Maybe they're sick and they haven't told anybody. Maybe they've traveled. Maybe they're in the hospital. Different things can happen. And what it does, it alerts me to the fact, hey, you know what? I need to reach out to them, see how they're doing. The fact is that if you don't see somebody for a couple of weeks, the first thought should be, I hope they're doing okay. I should reach out and see if they're doing okay. And that's what he means by consider one another. The fact is that depending on different seasons of life, we could be facing a lot of pressure, a lot of difficulties. And someone who's a little bit older, who loves us and cares about us, for them to come along and say, hey, I know you have a newborn in the house. You guys look tired. Is there anything we can do to be an encouragement to you? You know what? They might be like, nah, we're good. But I appreciate you thinking of me, okay? Yesterday we sang at all the seniors, and they were ready. I don't think you were told, like, were people coming to your house? Every senior that we went to visit, they were there. They were ready, And it was an opportunity to just minister, be an encouragement, be a blessing. Consider one another. We need to have a loving concern for one another, not this condescension or anything like that, but that we genuinely care for the good of others. And then there's another statement: consider to provoke to love and to good works. And I believe that affection is something that is created in a context. I really believe that. Okay, Tori, I'll give an example. Yesterday we were right in the van, and we were talking about how Christmas season is it's pretty grueling for some people. Okay, it really is. And Tori was like, yeah. So I was thinking about asking questions about what was like the most memorable gift that you had when you were a kid, or the most memorable Christmas, or what's your favorite holiday treat and stuff like that. And what's funny, as we were talking about it, like everybody was just like, I love Christmas. Now, there's still like a lot of pressure that's associated with the holidays, and who do we get together with? How long? Where do we do this? Oh, this person's sick. We have this program where it is complicated trying to work through some of these things. These gifts are going to be expensive this year, and should we give gifts to our kids? And if we should, what kind? And I mean, these are all things that are questions that we encounter. But when you start talking about some of the good memories you had when you were a child, it just kind of like warms your heart. And you're like, oh yeah, I remember we had a white Christmas one year, and we went sledding after we opened gifts, or just sat by the fire and ate Christmas cookies. And here's the point. Affection comes out of context. Even in our marriages, if all we do is we just talk about, the basics of life, and it's just like, like a business partnership, well, then there won't be a lot of warmth in the home. Okay, there really won't. But when our lives are interconnected and we really are pouring our heart into one another, guess what comes out? Affection, love. Well, in the church context, there is a sense in which our interaction should provoke to not tension and difficult, but to love and to good works. Like, I should walk away. And I've had many people communicate this to me before. I've had people say, I was thinking about not going to church this morning. It was nasty weather. I'm tired. I'm depressed. I didn't want to be here. And then I came, and I can't tell you how uplifted I was by, and they name a couple things. And it's like, they were just little things. But it was the community It might have been the text of scripture. It might have been a song that was sung. But God uses that to stir us up and to kind of, rekindle those passions in our hearts. And we all need it. We all get discouraged, and life has a lot of weary aspects to it. And so provoke to love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is. And then he says this, so much the more as you see the day approaching. The closer we get to the return of Christ, the more we could say the world that we live in will be the kind of world where you really, really need the connection of the local church. And that's the point. And so, it's so very important that at the core of what we do and why we do it, that it is healthy, because a passage like this falls flat if the church is not what it's supposed to be, okay? If the church is contentious, if the church is not Christ-centered and gospel-focused, that passage of scripture, I would have to say, you need to go to a church that is, but these people didn't have that option. The church was their community, okay? So corporate worship, the idea that we're looking at here is that there are different levels here. There is my personal communion with God. There is what goes on in the home. And then there is the corporate context of the gathering of the body. And by the way, the gathering of the body is under authority. A pastor is an overseer. That word bishop means an overseer. The idea is that my job is not just to preach the word, but it's to make sure that as a church, we're functioning in a way that we're actually doing what the Bible tells us to do. We're conscientious about what we emphasize and how we go about doing it. And whereas in your private walk, you're kind of like overseeing yourself. And in the family context, it's dad. He's the one who's guiding the home, or if it's a single parent home, it's the parent that guides the home in that particular situation. So we see these different layers. And I want to put a fourth one in there. I say, I'm not putting it in there because I just want to. I'm putting it in there because it's in the Bible. Colossians chapter 3, verse 22. Here's what it says. Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. Now, that word servant is maybe a little softer than what was going on in the ancient Roman world. That was a person who was a servant in bonds. That was a person who was a domestic servant. When we use the term slave, I think that in our minds, we tend to think of what was going on pre-Civil War in the United States. And I would not necessarily put this in the same category, okay? We're not talking about people who were kidnapped. We're talking about people who were probably indebted. We're talking about people who may have been in a situation where they say, I cannot support myself because I don't have land, but I'm going to almost like indenture myself to a wealthy person, and that person ended up being their bookkeeper. That person handled their finances, handled their household, taught their children, all different kinds of things. But the idea was that this is a person whose daily labor, they need to understand that daily labor is something that has a connection back to worship. That's what he's saying. And so he says, obey those who are over you. Don't do it just because they see it or just because it makes them happy. Do it with a singular focus to serve the Lord. Now, I remember when I was in seminary, I worked with a guy, I did construction, and I only did it about a year and a half, partially because I was financially broke after I did it. Trying to do school and trying to work full time at the same time was a lot. So I went into the grad assistant program. But I remember the work. It was very hard work. I mean, construction in Florida, it's hot. I mean, people here in Maryland, they're like, oh, it's 92 degrees. It's so bad. And I'm like, Yeah, that's what it was in April at the house when I was growing up. And then it was like that until Thanksgiving. And then it was very humid. And I just remember like, getting to the job and it's like the sun's coming up and I'm already like saturated by just cleaning up the job site. And there were days that, and I worked for a Christian, but he was a tough guy. I'll use that way. He was a tough guy. And I just remember some days, I just was like, I hate what I'm doing. I mean, I hate it. I was with a passion. I'm standing here, I'm like doing these cuts, and he's like, long 42 and short 38. And I'm like, what again? He's like, listen up, young man, why can't you hear me? And I'm like, because you're way up there and I'm cutting this stuff and there's a generator and all these things. And I'm just like, oh, I'm hot, this is terrible, Like, maybe I could fall off the roof and I could end up in the hospital and be like, I'm so sorry, I'm so hard on you, No, I wouldn't really want to be in that position. But I just remember some days I was like, oh, I got to drive to work and I'm exhausted and it's Thursday and I got to do this all day today and then tomorrow. And he might tell me I need to come on Saturday too. But there were times that scriptures like this reminded me, God gave you that job. God gave you that job. He gave you that job so that you'd be a responsible young man and you'd pay for school and not be in debt when you're done. And you know what? You ought to be thankful you work for a Christian. And you ought to be thankful that, you work for a guy who's not, foul-mouthed all day and you listen to all this garbage. Like he was a hard guy, he was a tough guy, but he was a good man. And, I just started processing some of those things. And there were times I had to sit down and say, Father, thank you for giving me a job. And I'm going to do this for you because I don't feel like doing it for him right now. But, pretty much any kind of job you do could fall into this category at some point. I mean, even the raising of our own children. There'll be days that you're like, I did not want to wake up to a diaper that's all the way up my kid's back. And they crawled out of their little cage and they bumped all their way down the stairwell. And now I got to get carpet shampoo out and clean the stairwell. I love my child, but I don't love this moment of life. Yep, it's true. But you know what? God called you to be a parent, so do it as unto the Lord. And the way that he puts it is, whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. And one of the things that gives a Christian with a biblical worldview a good work ethic is that the rest of the world isn't guided by this principle. They're guided by, if my boss sees me, then I work hard. If he doesn't, we'll see what I can get away with. I'm tired of this job. You don't pay me enough. I'm going to go find another one. And, I earn enough money so I could just, take 4 months off. I don't have to worry about this, for a while. And the simple fact is that the things that motivate the world are very different than what should motivate us as Christians. And what's amazing is we may be doing the same work with the same intensity, but for a totally different motive. Totally different motive. And it's so critically important that we understand that part of our worship, part of our submission to God is doing our work as unto the Lord and not unto men. So when we talk about worship, we have to recognize that this is an all-encompassing part of life. Okay? It encompasses all of our lives. So any questions before we move on to part 3, which will be part 4? Yeah, go ahead.
We need to pay attention because, we're talking about the older age and younger.
Yep.
So if we're going to be thanks to general administration, he told me when my kids get a car, their first car has a standard variation. We learn how to do the car, the clutch, and their friend can't learn.
So I bought a standard truck, and I learned how to drive it on a bridge coming out of Navarre in bumper to bumper traffic. Oh man, yeah, 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 absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And when we talk about the shaping of our children. I mean, their work ethic, why they do what they do, why we go to church, what's important at church, how we process the things that we're dealing with in life, how we relate to other people. Like these are all things that they're critical, and we really need to teach them. And when we don't, when the Bible says, provoke not your children to anger, we tend to think like I was too harsh in that situation, and they're mad at me, and that certainly happens. But another thing that might happen is when your kid's 25, they're like, I really wish my dad would have taught me this. I wish my mom would have taught me this. I wish they'd have taught me some things that they didn't. There were some deficiencies. And they're actually upset after the fact, looking back at those deficiencies. And then they have their own children. They recognize it's harder than they realize. And then they kind of like, they pull it back a little bit. And they start realizing, this is tough. Your children don't come with a manual. They come with nothing but the DNA that God gave them from you. So, and a sin nature. They're good. Uh, I wouldn't put too much stock into the order that I put there because we don't really have the Bible laying that out. But what I will say is that, before you are the head of a household, you're an individual. Of course, you're a part of a family. But I do feel that corporate worship is really, really affected by the home. I really do. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's not easy when you come to the issue of prioritization. That's a tough thing, and I feel like the issue of prioritization is more of a, I don't know if trajectory is the right word, but it's the pattern. I don't so much, if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I got this issue, what do you think about it? How do you get help? I'm not so much interested in the one incident of where you got really upset or whatever. I'm kind of interested in what's the pattern of life that you have, because the pattern's either a good one or a bad one, healthy or very unhealthy. And the things that kind of get us to the point where we have a conversation with somebody, they're like not the cause, they're the effect. They're the downstream. And so, like, poor priorities are probably more dealing with poor patterns. And some people are workaholics because they're disappointed in their family life and they don't want to be at home. Some are workaholics because they're greedy. Some are workaholics because their job demands that they are, and they may have to consider a different kind of work. Or some people are workaholics because they are people pleasers and they don't know how to tell someone, no, I'm not going to do that. So an issue in labor could be a lot. There could be a lot of different potential things there. Or someone might be a workaholic, so they don't do corporate worship. Okay, or they're a workaholic, so they don't do family worship, or they don't do private worship. Okay, but what I'm concerned about is pattern. And then when there's a problem, you go, okay, let's get to the root of it and let's ask, where's the pattern off? Let's start working on the pattern, because the downstream changes as you establish a different pattern of life. No, go ahead.
Do you think there's a application for worship, an application towards schooling, whether you're Christian school, public school? Is there an application there for how we should, whether we should be in the world and not.
Like how we school our children, like
Yeah, I mean, because if you pull. I don't know, something.
well, but then the other question sometimes you have to ask is, so is this system so corrupt it's impossible to turn it? And you know, there are situations where something is so rotten that you know, if the tooth has gotten to the point where it's irreparable, then you got to just pull the tooth.
It's kind of. I would point.
Yeah. But what I would say is this: if our motivation to not have our children interacting with lost people is that we just protect them from everything, I think that's actually dangerous, because our goal should be to prepare them to live in a world that is anti-Christian, because that's the world that we live in, and we don't want them to just, you know, be isolated. We want them, but we do recognize that people mature not all at the same level. You know, values are things that take time for people to develop. Well, what's funny is you have some families that they'll put a gun in a kid's hand at 5, and they don't have any worry about it. They feel totally comfortable putting a gun in a 5-year-old's hand, and they will train them and those kinds of things. You have some people that they tell their kid, when you leave this house at 18, you better not go buy a gun, because those things are dangerous. But what makes a gun dangerous is what you do with it. I mean, it's a tool, frankly speaking, a tool that could take someone's life, a tool that can create tremendous damage, but, you know, so is your car. You know, you get behind the wheel, you could kill a lot of people with your car because you were texting, or because you decided to, you know, be irresponsible in some way, you know, speeding, things like that. So, you know, we have to teach our young people, we have to, you know, be honest about where they're at in their maturity level. We have to push them, but, you know, we have to be proportionate in how we push them, recognize they're not all maturing at the same level. And I think that's a decision that an individual family has to make. But whatever they choose, it's going to come with some challenges. Homeschooling children comes with huge challenges. It puts pressure on the family. A lot of people really don't have a good education background, and they would educate their children very poorly if they chose to do that. Some people, their children don't develop the way that they should because they don't interact with anybody. But then on the other side, there are homeschool families that their kids are the sharpest kids you'd ever meet. They are very good at interacting with other people. When they go to get a job, they're going to have no trouble because they will do very well in interviews. They will conduct themselves with tremendous, you know, with excellence. And when they get into the business world, they're going to move quickly through the ranks because people recognize they're trustworthy and hardworking. So whatever a person's doing, they're going to have to think through making sure their children are well-rounded and grounded, and that they are well-equipped to deal with the challenges of life. But you want to think about it before you see the negative consequences of poor patterns. Yeah. There was a hand back here. Yeah.
The ability to keep that the kids needed. The responsible thing is actually more of a private school situation.
Yeah.
We don't have the kids to stay in the education.
Yeah. But, you know, in terms of what the Bible teaches about human nature, we recognize that it's not just restraining our children from what's outside of them, it's also teaching them to deal with what's inside of them. And the truth is, what's inside of you is going to create more problems than what's around you. What's around you just draws out what's inside of you. And So we have to be very prudent in how we work with our kids, but yeah. Amy, there's certain contexts that are frankly dangerous for our children to be in. We shouldn't put them in them, you know? So things like that. I think we probably should ask some questions about the kind of media access we allow our children to have. I mean, there are people that'll protect their children from lots of things, but they'll put a phone in their hands that is going to give them access to unbelievable evil, and their heart and your children, in a context where you have very rigid expectations, but you don't know what's going on in their hearts, they will become master deceivers. And so we've got to really be cautious. We've got to talk to our kids a lot about what's going on in their lives. So, all right. What a high note to end this moment on. I'm looking and I'm going, part number 3, healthy corporate worship starts in our homes. Well, I think that's where we'll start next week. So, all right.